In the early years of post-war America, when optimism was marketed as a national identity and cinema served as its most effective mirror, Hollywood relied on clarity. Heroes were confident, villains were visible, and emotional struggle existed only to be conquered by the final reel. Into this carefully controlled ecosystem stepped Montgomery Clift, a man whose presence quietly destabilized everything the industry believed about strength, masculinity, and success. He did not arrive with bravado or theatrical authority. Instead, he appeared hesitant, thoughtful, and inwardly occupied, as if he were already listening to something the audience could not hear. From the beginning, his performances suggested not triumph, but awareness, and that distinction would define both his greatness and his erasure. Clift's acting felt radically different because it refused to reassure. Where other stars delivered certainty, he delivered vulnerability without resolution. His characters were not men on a journey toward clarity, but men suspended in doubt, wrestling with emotions they could neither escape nor articulate. This approach resonated deeply with audiences who had lived through war, loss, and rapid social change. Yet it also made executives uneasy. Hollywood thrived on transformation narratives, on characters who learned lessons and emerged stronger. Montgomery Clift offered something more unsettling: emotional truth that lingered beyond the closing credits. As his fame grew throughout the early 1950s, critics began to describe him not merely as a talented actor, but as a shift in cinematic language itself. He was not performing emotions, he was inhabiting them. Fellow actors studied him closely, recognizing that his restraint carried more power than exaggeration ever could. Audiences responded with devotion, sensing that Clift was not asking for admiration, but for understanding. Yet while the public embraced him, Clift himself remained deeply uncomfortable with the apparatus surrounding his success. He viewed celebrity not as a reward, but as a distortion, something that threatened to flatten complex human experience into marketable images. Away from the screen, Clift lived with an almost austere simplicity. He avoided excess, shunned luxury, and resisted the social obligations that accompanied stardom. Interviews felt invasive to him, premieres felt hollow, and publicity campaigns struck him as dishonest. What he valued instead were private acts of responsibility. He gave money away quietly, without acknowledgement, helping friends pay medical bills, supporting struggling artists, and donating to causes aligned with his sense of justice. He believed that morality lost its meaning once it became performative, and he refused to allow his generosity to be folded into his public image. This resistance placed him in subtle conflict with Hollywood long before his withdrawal became obvious. Studios tolerated his independence because his talent was undeniable, but there was always an expectation that he would eventually conform. That expectation was shattered by the car accident that nearly ended his life. The crash left him with severe facial injuries and chronic pain that would follow him for the rest of his days. Newspapers framed the incident as a temporary obstacle, a dramatic setback on the road to a heroic comeback. What went unspoken was how deeply the accident fractured his sense of identity. His face, once central to his presence, was altered, and with it his relationship to the camera changed irrevocably. When Clift returned to acting, the transformation was unmistakable. His performances became heavier, slower, and more difficult to watch, not because they lacked skill, but because they carried unfiltered suffering. Pain was no longer something he portrayed. It was something he lived through each role. Directors, accustomed to control and predictability, found this unsettling. Studios, increasingly focused on. When Clift returned to acting, the transformation was unmistakable. His performances became heavier, slower, and more difficult to watch, not because they lacked skill, but because they carried unfiltered suffering. Pain was no longer something he portrayed. It was something he lived through each role. Directors, accustomed to control and predictability, found this unsettling. Studios, increasingly focused on efficiency and profitability, grew wary of an actor whose emotional reality could not be neatly managed. Hollywood had room for tragedy, but only when it could be contained within narrative boundaries. Clift's pain refused containment. Gradually, his withdrawal began to take shape. It did not announce itself with scandal or defiance. Instead, it unfolded quietly, through absences that accumulated over time. Interviews were declined, appearances canceled, roles turned down without explanation. Friends noticed that he retreated into solitude, avoiding conversations that required him to justify his choices. Agents complained that he became unreachable for weeks at a time. In the absence of clarity, speculation filled the void. Some attributed his withdrawal to addiction, others to lingering injuries, and some suggested that he had simply lost interest in acting. These explanations failed to capture the deeper truth. Montgomery Clift was retreating from exposure itself. As the 1960s progressed, Hollywood's attention shifted toward new faces and new narratives. The industry moved forward with little regard for those who no longer fit its evolving image. Clift was not rejected with hostility, but with indifference, which proved far more devastating. He continued to work sporadically, but the reverence that once surrounded him had dissipated. Roles became smaller, budgets lower, and expectations diminished. He did not protest this change or attempt to reclaim his former status. Instead, he seemed to accept obscurity as a form of relief, a space where he no longer. He did not protest this change or attempt to reclaim his former status. Instead, he seemed to accept obscurity as a form of relief, a space where he no longer had to perform resilience for public consumption. Despite declining health and increasing financial strain, Clift maintained his commitment to helping others. He continued to give money away, often at great personal cost, refusing assistance even when it was urgently needed. Friends later recalled that he seemed determined not to let his suffering become leverage. He did not seek pity, nor did he allow his pain to define his public identity. In a culture that rewards confession and visibility, this refusal rendered him increasingly invisible. By the late 1960s, Montgomery Clift had largely vanished from public consciousness. He was still alive, still acting occasionally, but no longer present in the cultural imagination. Younger audiences barely recognized his name, while older audiences remembered him vaguely, as if recalling a figure from another era whose relevance had quietly expired. When news of his death finally reached the public, the reaction was subdued. The tragedy lay not in the suddenness of the loss, but in the realization that he had been absent for so long that his passing felt like an echo rather than an event. Hollywood offered respectful but restrained tributes, careful not to interrogate its own role in his disappearance. There was no widespread reckoning with how discomfort with vulnerability had contributed to his isolation, nor any acknowledgement of how the industry's demands had eroded one of its most sincere talents. Montgomery Clift's story did not fit neatly into narratives of excess, scandal, or redemption. It was quieter, more ambiguous, and therefore easier to overlook. Yet his disappearance continues to resonate because of what it reveals about the cost of honesty in a system built on illusion. Clift did not vanish because he lacked ambition, courage, or skill. He vanished because he refused to perform strength when he did not feel it, refused to commodify suffering, and refused to transform generosity into branding. In a world that rewards performance over truth, this refusal was unforgivable. His life stands as a quiet indictment of an industry that celebrates authenticity only until it becomes inconvenient. Montgomery Clift reminds us that not all disappearances are sudden or mysterious. Some unfold slowly, in plain sight, as the world looks away. And sometimes, the most haunting vanishing act is not when a star burns out spectacularly, but when it dims deliberately, choosing integrity over visibility and silence over survival. As the years passed, the gap between who Montgomery Clift had been and who the public expected him to remain grew wider and more painful. Hollywood was comfortable celebrating transformation only when it led to triumph, but deeply uncomfortable when change led to quiet withdrawal. Clift's evolving presence on screen no longer offered the reassurance audiences had been trained to expect. Instead, it reflected endurance without reward, survival without applause, and suffering without catharsis. This made his work harder to market and even harder to contextualize in an industry that relied on clear narratives of success and failure. What made Clift's disappearance particularly unsettling was that it lacked spectacle. There was no dramatic scandal to point to, no single interview that marked his retreat, no explosive confrontation with studios or executives. His absence accumulated slowly, almost invisibly, through a series of small refusals. He declined roles that felt hollow, stepped away from conversations that demanded optimism he did not feel, and resisted any attempt to turn his pain into a compelling comeback story. In doing so, he violated one of Hollywood's most unspoken rules. Suffering must always be redeemable, and preferably profitable. Those who remained close to him described a man who was not bitter, but deeply tired. He understood that the industry no longer knew how to hold him, yet he did not resent it for that failure. Instead, he withdrew further into a private world governed by personal ethics rather than public approval. He continued to help others quietly, even as his own resources dwindled, maintaining a belief that dignity was preserved not through visibility, but through restraint. This insistence on privacy, on moral consistency without witnesses, further distanced him from an era that increasingly rewarded confession and exposure. By the mid to late 1960s, Clift's name had begun to feel like a relic, spoken more often in retrospectives than in present conversations. Film culture moved quickly, embracing new aesthetics, new anxieties, and new stars who better reflected the changing mood of the country. Clift, once considered revolutionary, was now viewed as an artifact of an earlier emotional language. Yet the irony remained that his work felt more modern in its honesty than much of what replaced it. His disappearance was not a failure of relevance, but a failure of accommodation. When he did appear publicly, observers often remarked on how uncomfortable he seemed with attention, as though he no longer recognized the version of himself others expected to see. He did not perform nostalgia, nor did he offer explanations for his absence. There was no attempt to reclaim lost status or reframe his story into something inspirational. This refusal to narrativize his own life frustrated journalists and executives alike, but it was entirely consistent with who he had always been. Montgomery Clift never believed that life owed anyone coherence. In the final years of his life, his existence unfolded largely outside the public gaze. He lived quietly, surrounded by a small circle of acquaintances who respected his need for distance. His health continued to decline, but he resisted medical attention with the same determination he had resisted publicity. There was no desire to be preserved, documented, or redeemed. When death finally came, it did not interrupt a public presence. It merely confirmed an absence that had already settled in. The reaction to his passing was muted, not because he lacked significance, but because his disappearance had been gradual enough to dull collective awareness. Tributes emphasized his talent, his influence, and his early promise, but stopped short of confronting the discomfort at the center of his story. There was little appetite to ask why someone so gifted had faded so completely, or what that fading revealed about the industry itself. Montgomery Clift was mourned politely, then filed away as a tragic figure whose complexity was easier to admire than to understand. Yet his legacy persists in ways that resist easy categorization. Actors continue to cite him as a profound influence, not because of the roles he played, but because of the emotional honesty he dared to sustain. His performances remain unsettling precisely because they refuse to offer closure. They do not reassure the viewer that pain can always be overcome or that vulnerability will be rewarded. Instead, they insist that some experiences simply endure, untransformed and unresolved. Montgomery Clift's disappearance forces a reckoning with the cost of sincerity in a culture that thrives on performance. He did not vanish because he failed to adapt, but because adaptation would have required a betrayal of his inner life. In choosing silence over spectacle, privacy over relevance, and integrity over survival, he accepted a kind of erasure that most people, especially those touched by fame, spend their lives trying to avoid. His absence is not a mystery to be solved, but a consequence to be acknowledged. In the end, Montgomery Clift did not disappear from Hollywood in the way legends often do, consumed by excess or undone by scandal. He disappeared by refusing to continue playing a role that no longer reflected who he was. And in a system that demands perpetual performance, that refusal was enough to make him invisible. His story remains as a quiet reminder that not all disappearances are accidents, and not all losses are sudden. Some are chosen, slowly and deliberately, as the price of remaining honest in a world that no longer knows what to do with truth.